It's no secret that Sakamoto Days is known for its art. Suzuki's spiky but clean line work, the intricate details that go into characters' clothes and weapons, and the frequent uses of dynamic angles all go into making Sakamoto Days a masterclass in artistic presentation. But as with many manga, what you see today is not what you would have seen from Suzuki a year ago. While Sakamoto Days retains much of what initially made it stand out, in many ways it has evolved beyond the art of the first few chapters, so let's take a look at those changes. One of the most apparent and immediate changes you'll notice if you look at chapter 1 and compare it to the most recent chapters is the character design. There's this infamous panel of Sakamoto's goofy smile holding Hana, but the changes are more apparent than that. Take a look at Shin in Chapter 1 versus Shin in Chapter 221. Chapter 1 Shin's hair has noticeably less line work and looks a lot smoother, his face is generally more rounded with a less pronounced jaw, and his eyes have far less detail. Nagumo also looks massively different. He keeps the characteristically big eyes, but again, his face is rounder, his hair is longer, and looks flatter down his head. The major trend in Suzuki's character design is that as time goes on, their faces and hair receive more detail, and then they hop onto looks maxing and grow a jawline. This is actually super apparent with Shishiba, who literally has an egg-shaped head in his first appearance, while his most recent appearance has him seen with a much sharper jawline. And Hyo is a unique case of his design being massively overhauled. The general vibe is there, but his face just straight up looks different, and his body also became more muscular. There's a ton of other characters that received glow-ups as the series went on, but you get the point. The next major shift in the art style is the line work itself. Early Sakamoto Days had far cleaner line work with smooth, flowing strokes. Details like the wrinkle and folds of clothing, the outlines of characters' arms, and the pen strokes used to draw hair all featured a much more streamlined appearance. Contrast this with modern Sakamoto Days, and you see that things are a lot rougher. What was once a clean collection of lines has changed into a more chaotic, sprawling collection of lines and curves. You see this especially in clothing, as a lot of characters wear baggier clothes. Sakamoto's pants went from having a clear separation in the lines that created the folds to having a less ordered set of lines that blend and bleed into each other. Again, Sakamoto's arms went from having very clear, straight lines dictate their shape to having a blotchier style with thicker outlines and multiple small strokes as opposed to one large one. His hair as well, while more detailed in the sense that it has more lines, also looks less like a collection of straight strands and more like actual hair. The last big change in the art style I'd like to highlight is with the shading. Early on in Sakamoto Days, a lot of characters, especially Sakamoto himself, had a lot of shading, particularly on their faces and arms. And since this was early Sakamoto Days, the shading was done with large, clean strokes. Compared to more recent chapters, and you notice that the prevalence of shading has gone down. It's definitely still there, and on more impressive pages like double spreads, the shading reaches the prevalence of earlier in the manga, but just on your average panel, the shading is far more minimal and sometimes non-existent. Fat Sakamoto will sometimes have no shading at all, whereas earlier in the manga he was consistently shown with shading on his arms and under his chin. And in line with the previously mentioned line work, the shading that is present oftentimes looks sketchier and rougher. Now, despite me using words like sketchier, rougher, and chaotic as ways to describe how Sakamoto Days' art has changed, it does not mean that I dislike it. Just because things look less refined now doesn't mean that I think it looks worse. If anything, I actually prefer the modern art style to what was shown early on in the manga. But that doesn't change the fact that the art has changed, and it's about time we examine exactly why Suzuki's art has evolved so heavily. Something that has stayed consistent no matter the era of art though is Suzuki's style of motion. Whenever a character does a big attack, Suzuki covers their weapon of choice, be it their arms, legs, or actual weapon, in a bunch of speed lines, and the stylistic way Suzuki portrays this has stayed incredibly consistent. The thick, blurry, very apparent speed lines featured in Nagumo vs. Oki looks very similar to the one shown off all the way back in Chapter 5, giving Suzuki's action a timeless feel. Now, if you were to ask me the exact moment the art style hit its modern state, I wouldn't be able to tell you. There wasn't a single point in time in which the art style suddenly shifted into what we see today, and that's because Suzuki has always been evolving his art. Even just 30 chapters in, you can see some of the changes I've already mentioned. The hair is more detailed across characters, jawlines are slowly beginning to form, and the line work, while not particularly messy at this point, is definitely trending towards it. Fast forward another 30 chapters and you see another major shift, particularly in the character design. Shading is very prevalent and the line work is still mostly large, clean brushstrokes, but you can definitely tell the difference between Chapter 60 Shin and Chapter 1 Shin. If you were to ask me, I like to break down Sakamoto Days art into eras. You have the early volumes up until volume 5, where the characters are in their most primitive designs. Suzuki is still getting used to how he likes to draw his characters, environments, and action. And then you have the JAA Invasion arc, which is what I believe to be a big kickstart into evolving the art style. Izuki and Gaku's introduction to the story made everything a lot more brutal, and as a result, the line work on characters' actions and clothes got a lot messier. It definitely still looks like old Sakamoto Days, but things have massively changed from the first volume. Then, as the story goes on, it looks like Suzuki almost tones down the messiness with the JCC exams in the JCC infiltration arcs. Things look very clean in these two arcs, but there are still a few differences between the two. The JCC exam still has some of the features indicative of older character designs as seen with Shin and later seen with how characters like Akira, Toramaru, and Mafuyu change in their design. But as we go into the JCC infiltration arc, Yotsumura's mini arc, and then the flashback arc, this is what I would consider the peak of modern Sakamoto Days. Characters look like themselves, the line work is in that middle ground between refined and messy, and the shading is characteristically present without looking as sketch-like. As time goes on, Suzuki does seem to roughen up the art a bit, and this is expressly seen at the time of the museum arc. Certain chapters, particularly chapter 148, are very indicative of the way Suzuki has had to change up his art. And things sort of ebb and flow from here. Chapter 173 showed a marked decline in Suzuki's art, with characters, backgrounds, and even action, something that has stayed remarkably consistent over the years, looking almost unfinished. It was at this time that Suzuki took a break, and it became painfully clear what the cause for this change in art style was. As with many creators in the manga space, the pressure of having to keep up with a weekly release cadence, combined with the occasional color spreads and volume covers, left Suzuki tired and unable to refine chapters to his liking. Up until that point, I only remember Suzuki taking 2 or maybe 3 breaks that weren't caused by holidays, so it's clear that Suzuki was pushing himself relentlessly and ended up facing the pressure of weekly manga releases. Thankfully, Suzuki's break did seem to work, and the following chapter went back to looking far cleaner. And in general, that's sort of where we're at with Sakamoto Days art. For the most part, it has stayed relatively consistent since chapter 174, and while some chapters may have less pages or look a little rougher around the edges due to time constraints, Suzuki has remained largely consistent. There have even been some standouts for me, such as chapter 213, which featured character designs and line work that reminded me of the earlier, more refined days of the series, but Suzuki seems to have settled into a rhythm that he's hopefully really comfortable with. If I had to give you my favorite era of Sakamoto Days art, it would definitely be the time from the JCC infiltration arc to the flashback arc. Characters had evolved into their modern designs and the line work had gotten messier, but I think it had the perfect blend of all of Suzuki's traits. But that's just my opinion. Feel free to berate me in the comments.